My name is Patrick Toohey, and we've been at this office space since about September, and we're really happy to not be working out of our homes, at least I am, and it's a wonderful space to use for these events. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for spending your Tuesday morning with us. The conversation we're going to have today, a lot of the supporters of the earnings tax pose it as, are we going to collect this tax or are we not? Which is really a false choice. The question we ought to be asking ourselves is, how ought Kansas City to tax itself to provide for the important services that every city needs? And so it's not just a matter of, are we going to do this, but let's take a step back. And I want to give you a trigger warning here. If you're very sensitive, I know that some people in City Hall become overwhelmed when we talk about the earnings tax. They're afraid that, as the mayor said the other day, we're going to have to fire 800 police officers over 10 years. So we've got some soft furniture in the back. If you feel that you're going to become faint with all this talk about reform, please take advantage of those comfortable chairs. So let's just talk about some of the facts surrounding the earnings tax, and I've tried to come up with just a few bullet points that are not in dispute, that the city agrees with us. First of all, the earnings tax is a 1% flat tax levied on every person who lives or works in Kansas City proper. There is no exemption for low-income workers. You don't get the first $27,000 off. The first dollar you earn, the city takes 1%. The city claims it takes, I think, the exact number it says is around $238 million each year, and that is up because we found out 5 years ago when we voted on this, the earnings tax the first time, that the city hadn't been doing a very good job of collecting it. And by the way, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on in the presentation, the mere fact that we are having this discussion in Kansas City, the simple fact that every 5 years we vote on the earnings tax is itself having positive policy repercussions. The mayor is going to the east side. He's talking about how he wants to spread TIF around. He's addressing blight. And so this conversation is very important. 5 years ago, the city just didn't want to talk about it. I'll show you that clip in a minute. But the fact that you're here and that the city has an opportunity to vote on this is already a good thing. The money that's collected in the earnings tax goes to the general fund and can be spent however the city likes. It's not spoken for like many sales taxes, for example. And about 75% of the largest 100 cities in the United States do not have an earnings tax at all, and yet they manage to provide public safety, police, fire. You'll see my friend, and he is my friend, Steve Glorioso, talking about how 4,000 localities collect the earnings tax, and that may be true, but there are 19,000 localities in the United States. So again, only about a quarter collect the earnings tax. How else are we taxed? Well, there are lots of ways we're taxed. We have a sales tax. I live in Waldo. The sales tax at the Burger King near my house is right around 10%, if not over. If you've been to the Power and Light District, I think you pay 12.5% tax. We have community improvement districts, transportation development districts, and I think it was the Tax Foundation said that Kansas City was one of the 15 highest taxed cities in the country. We have a property tax. The Brookings Institution looked at Jackson County, Platte, and Clay and said relative to other counties, we have one of the highest property taxes. And of course, the city also levies fees on our utilities, which is another way the city collects money, and in many ways another kind of tax. The drawbacks of the earnings tax. Now, taxes are necessary. Taxes themselves are not evil. But there are very many ways to collect an earnings tax, or forgive me, to collect any kind of tax, and each one comes with its drawbacks. And so the discussion that the Show Me Institute is eager to have with voters in Missouri is that let's pick a tax that is least distortionary. Because ultimately what a tax does is increase the price of goods. And we all act the same way, whether we're hiring people or buying buildings or buying sour cream at the grocery store. When the price of something goes up, we buy less of it. It's just a simple fact of economics. And so what happens, what a tax does is it increases the price of things. And in Kansas City, as we've seen, people either, if they're moving to the area, have a choice to move outside the city and in effect give themselves a 1% raise. It does affect decision making. And in fact, the city of Kansas City concedes this, openly concedes that taxes are too high in Kansas City. Because the reason that the Economic Development Corporation of Kansas City exists is to cut people's taxes. They'll say to Cerner, they'll say to Applebee's, they'll say to Freight Quote, stay here or come here and we will cut your taxes. And what is that but an admission that taxes affect where people and businesses move? The problem is they don't want to give the tax cut to everybody. They just give it to the people who have good lawyers, who have good lobbyists, or who have relationships with politicians. So the argument isn't, do taxes affect behavior? That's conceded. The point is, whose behavior is it going to affect? Like I said, some taxes are more distortionary than others. Income taxes are the worst. You can pick up your job and move it across state line or out of the county. Sales taxes, you drive up and down state line, you can see there are gas stations on the Missouri side, there are liquor stores on the Missouri side, and there are dentist's office on the Kansas side. I'm not quite sure. But because it affects behavior, people take their purchasing power and go across state line. Property tax, unless perhaps you're the Russians in Crimea, you cannot pick up property and move it across the border. So they are the taxes that are least distortionary. And again, as a result, and this is not just right-wing economists, this is generally agreed left and right, that high income taxes depress jobs and population growth. So this is the rhetoric. Now, before I worked at the Show Me Institute, 5 years ago, when the earnings tax, when the petitions were first being passed around to gather the earnings tax, City Hall marched all their councilmen outside to have a press conference. This is when Kay Barnes referred to Rex Sinkfield, one of the founders of the Show Me Institute, as an out-of-state billionaire, before Dave Helling had to ask her in the Q&A if Missouri was considered outside of Missouri, or if St. Louis was considered outside of Missouri. But I want to play a clip for you here, and I don't know if you'll be able to hear it. I put some speakers on my laptop, but I had a chance to ask a question afterwards, which nobody liked to hear. So the sound quality is poor. The camera is shaky, forgive me. I didn't have a stabilizer, but I think the content is important.
Jan, you said in your comment that if this passed, you would, the city council would have to increase taxes or property taxes or cut services. Are you saying now that you would vote to increase taxes on seniors and vote to increase property taxes and vote to increase income taxes and cut services?
No, I just said we need a plan. I mean, if these cuts were to come about, we need a plan to replace that money.
Does the city council have a plan?
The city council is looking to its leadership.
We passed a resolution to.
Right.
To what?
We passed a resolution to look at all the different options, but there's no turn off in the light switch.
Right.
There's no way to do this overnight.
5 years later, 6 years later now, the city has no plan. Nothing. They've done nothing. They have known that Kansas City is going to face this election every 5 years, and they've done absolutely nothing. And the argument we hear from them 6 years later is exactly the same. If you cut this tax, we will have to increase taxes, we will have to cut services, public safety is in danger. So this is city government. These are the people that run this operation. Troy Schulte, of course, the city manager, the guy that sits on top of all of it. And they've done absolutely nothing. They would prefer to have the fear, they'd prefer to have the anxiety over the earnings tax than they would to find out what the options are. And so this is what they're saying now. It's a bleak future without the Kansas City earnings tax, said Sly James. As Kansas City goes, so goes the region, and if the region and St. Louis take a hit, so does Missouri. In fact, anybody who looks at the economies on the Missouri side around Kansas City, you'll see that they are actually growing and prospering. So the fact that as Kansas City goes, so goes the state is demonstrably untrue. And this is a particularly objectionable quote, I find, when the mayor spoke to the Baptist Ministers Union just a few weeks ago. I was able to attend, and he said we're going to lose 800 cops over 10 years. That is unbelievable. That is just not credible at all. No city is going to fire, I think, a third of their police force simply over a tax. What they would do is what they need to do, which is look at their various sources of income, figure out how they can increase income, figure out how they can cut costs, and then move forward. But they don't want to do that. And without a vote on the earnings tax, they really aren't held accountable to those issues. So this is great. I don't know if you know Terrence Nash. Terrence Nash is a kind of a civic activist and you would guess a hoarder. This is a letter from our mayor in Kansas City in 1971 that he handed to me, and it talks about, the earnings, we just passed the earnings tax last December, and good things are going to happen, and together we can make Kansas City, Missouri a model of cleanliness and beauty, a real showplace for the nation. So let's look at the showplace for the nation just a few blocks east of here. My colleague Elizabeth and I went out the other day to take some pictures. So a model of cleanliness and beauty. So there's a no dumping sign that is being ignored. That is a city-owned property. That is not an absentee landlord. The city of Kansas City owns that property. The city of Kansas City owns that property. I don't remember if they own that property, but it's collapsing in on itself. Here's another one. The city owns this property, and I understand the people in the neighborhood have been calling for weeks to have that trash picked up. The city does not own that property, I don't believe, but it's right across the street here. You see trash strewn about, and the city is not coming to clean it up. They're not maintaining it. And so again, this is the model of cleanliness and beauty that we're going to export around the country. And again, the problem is the city is not performing basic services such as code enforcement and maintaining its own property. So one of the things the mayor has talked about when he kind of gives a history of the earnings tax is he said, well, we passed the earnings tax in the late 60s when Kansas City had a spike in murders. And so we needed the earnings tax to increase our ability to provide public safety. And there's some truth to that. We passed it in 1970. In the late 60s, we had seen a spike. It went down just before we passed it, but it was higher than it had been. It was even much lower in the early 60s. But here are our homicides now. We've got a slight kind of a trend upward, but the numbers aren't that much different. I mean, it was more raucous back then, but we've pretty much stayed where we are. And so 50 years ago, we had blight in our neighborhoods, and we had a high murder rate. And today, we have blight in our neighborhoods, and a high murder rate, and an earnings tax. I would argue the city has not benefited greatly from having an earnings tax. So I talked about how only a quarter of other cities have an earnings tax. And in 2013, my colleague Michael Rathbone did a great paper where he kind of studied how Kansas City and 7 peer cities collected revenue. It's a fascinating paper. I've got copies back there. And these are the cities we looked at: Tulsa, Oklahoma City, Indianapolis, Denver, Louisville, and of course St. Louis. And when we were first determining these cities, we looked at demographics, we looked at income, education, poverty levels. We tried to find cities that were really peers to Kansas City. And I even brought this list to Troy Schulte, the city manager, and I said, what do you think? And he had us add Denver to our list. We wouldn't have had Denver on our list, but he said that's kind of aspirational. And he didn't like that Tulsa was on the list, not because of anything substantive. I think Kansas Cityans really don't like to think of ourselves like Tulsa. But nevertheless, it's on the list. So St. Louis collects an earnings tax, and they collect more per person than we do. And Indianapolis collects an earnings tax. And so I said, well, that's interesting. And I looked around. Well, look at that. Indianapolis doesn't collect a sales tax. In Kansas City, like I said earlier, we collect an income tax. We collect a sales tax. We collect property taxes. But other cities choose differently from that menu of options, and again are still able to provide basic city services, I'm sure at a level equal to or greater than Kansas City. And my colleague Patrick Ishmael, who's here this morning, wrote a post about Kansas City's taxes, and I've got a copy at the back there, just making the point that Kansas City's taxes aren't relatively low. What happens is people in Missouri look at the state sales tax and they say, oh, well, the state sales tax is low, therefore Kansas City's taxes are low. But of course, they forget about all those additional taxes that the city adds on top, and again, we stack. And so sometimes it gets close to, if not over, 10%. So what are the alternatives, right? This is what, despite the fact that the city has a finance department and all these smart people and have done nothing for 6 years, they turn to us and say, what are the alternatives? And one of the things I think Kansas City ought to do, it would be great if the city was on board with us and said, well, let's actually investigate what other cities do and find out what fits with Kansas City values. So what could we replace it with? Well, the Kansas City Star did an editorial last week where they called out the Show Me Institute and me by name and said the Show Me Institute has not provided any alternative to the earnings tax. Now had, I presume, Yael Abuhalka sat down in front of Google and typed in Show Me Institute and how to replace the earnings tax, he would have found this, I think, 8-year-old paper now called, conveniently, How to Replace the Earnings Tax in Kansas City. And it's a paper written by an economist, so it's not something that I would read too thoroughly. It's got a lot of numbers in it, but the gist of it is that the property tax that we have in Kansas City and elsewhere is really a kind of a combination of 2 different taxes. There is the tax on the land itself, and then the tax on the improvement on top of it. I think Jackson County has in the past done a pretty poor job of assessing property, but there are two different ways of doing it. And the difference in the two is very important because, like I said, when you tax an improvement, when you tax a building, you create an incentive not to improve. But when you tax just the land, it's the least distortionary. Well, Kansas City could certainly investigate a way to tax land that doesn't discourage people from building, and in fact, might actually encourage people who are sitting on undeveloped property to just sell it. Sell it to somebody who will develop it. Again, tax policy affects incentives, and it's no reason why we can't come up with a tax policy that encourages people to build and to stay and move into Kansas City. And again, so it's just the bigger picture. One of the things that we talked about is how the city spends money. And I've had great fun with this paper. In fact, we wrote this chapter for a book for the Urban League. The Urban League's State of Black Kansas City in 2015. And Gwen Grant invited us to write a chapter on TIF. It gave us a week to write it. I don't know if any of you have ever worked for a think tank, but we do nothing in a week. So I had to call everybody up and down the pipeline and say, I need to grease the skids for this because we've got to get it done. But we divided the city first into what we determined to be the impoverished areas and the less impoverished areas. So the green area is where less than 30% of the population lives under the poverty level. And the red is where 30% or more of the population is in the poverty level. And then using Jackson County numbers, we looked at where all the TIF projects were and where the city was investing and spending its money, and the size of the circle denotes the size of the investment. And we found, no surprise, that the city largely invests in the parts of town that don't need help. The exception, of course, right up here is the riverfront. They are building luxury high-rises there, and so I think what will probably happen is that carve-out there will quickly become green. And so again, it's not just a matter of how we collect money, it's how we spend it, because if we spent less, we wouldn't need to collect as much. What it was is I think, well-intentioned government effort to encourage people to develop in the areas they wouldn't otherwise develop in, right? Blighted areas, places that have been economically unattractive for years. The problem is the definition the government uses is kind of wishy-washy as to what is blighted. So the plaza is considered blighted in Kansas City. We invest in plaza, we subsidize that. The River Market is blighted. Burns and McDonnell, I didn't stop by to get a picture of the building, but Burns and McDonnell in my neighborhood at 95th and Warnell was considered blighted, and so we paid Burns and McDonnell to build a brand new headquarters. And of course the Power and Light District is blighted. And I've been trying to figure out, a lot of people who are fans of TIF policy point to Power and Light and say, look at all the shiny new things we built. And gosh, what it looked like 10 years ago was awful. And I wondered to myself, is there any way to try to figure out the actual benefit of the Power and Light District? So I know that in Kansas City does an odd thing. We require that our servers, our bartenders, and our waiters and waitresses have health cards. And so I called over to Regulated Services and I said, over the last 10 years, please tell me how many health cards have been in existence each year. And tell me how many liquor licenses you've issued to stores and restaurants over the last 10 years. Because the theory I was operating under is that we had so much investment, we've got all this new stuff, so after Power and Light was built, there should have been a spike in those numbers. And I also looked at the annual report for income. So citywide now, not just Power and Light, but citywide, our income has been pretty flat. I think the red line here is the interest or the inflation. So we've been pretty flat. We've got a spike here. They haven't released the numbers for 2015 yet. And the number of liquor cards issued to individuals who work in restaurants and the number of liquor licenses has remained perfectly flat. That's citywide now, and this marks the date of the investment in downtown. And so what's happened is if there had been a creation of jobs and businesses in the downtown district, it has come, it's been a wash citywide. So what does that mean? We haven't created businesses, we've moved them. all the businesses and jobs that exist here were once in Waldo or Westport. They were somewhere else in the city, and this incentive has just moved it here. And in some cases, it may have moved it from just a block outside the TIF district to inside the TIF district. It's called diversion. And so all we've done really is poured a bunch of money into downtown. We haven't seen a net growth in tax income. We haven't seen a net growth in jobs or businesses. It's been a wash. And of course, the difference is that we're paying $15 million on top of this every year just for the bonds. But the Kansas City Star and a lot of people will look at that and say, well, look at all that economic development. More than likely what we've done is we've developed property, right? We've built shiny things, but we haven't actually seen an increase in the local economy. So here's just a summary. I'm wrapping up now of our talk. Again, the potential reforms are phase out the earnings tax. And by the way, and you guys may already know this, the opportunity on April 5 is not just to stop it cold. It would be a 10-year phase out of the earnings tax. So the first 2 years, maybe the city could probably sell some of the property it's been sitting on, I'm sure. I want to start researching whether or not Kansas City could sell its water department. We always talk about, well, it's an enterprise fund, so we don't spend any money on it and we don't get any money from it. I'm like, that's great. Why do we even own a water department? We don't own the power company. We don't own the gas company. I had an opportunity to kind of ask that question in a debate in South Kansas City with Scott Wagner, who actually stood up afterwards and said, well, the reason why the city owns the water department is because if you have a problem with the water department, you can call 311 and get it resolved. And people actually laughed in the crowd. They actually laughed. But that was his reasoning. We could move to a land value tax. Frankly, I suspect that if Kansas City restricted its spending, we wouldn't need to replace the earnings tax dollar for dollar. Rein in the TIF giveaways. I have yet to look up this number, but one of the taxing jurisdictions told me, and this is incredible to me, that 18% of the land value in Kansas City is abated. We've just told the developer, you don't have to pay this. 18%. Now, you could argue with me and say there is an absolute reason for abatement and for TIF, for the city to incentivize people to develop, and I'll concede that. But at some point, the number gets too high, and I think at 18% we're probably too high. And again, a serious effort to control spending. And this is not just the Show Me Institute saying that. Even the Kansas City Star says the budget keeps growing and growing and growing. And the size of Kansas City government has outstripped the size of our population. The problem is too many people will agree with that, but every time the city wants to spend money, they'll say yes, right? So they say, oh yeah, that's a good idea. No, this is a good idea. This is a good idea. And at the end of it, like, oh my goodness, look at all the money we're spending. And the other problem, and this is a real frustration, and it goes back to the Show Me Institute's ability to suggest alternatives, is that Kansas City is not transparent. They just don't want to tell us the information we need to know. Business Journal ran this story the other day. The incentive story the city doesn't want to tell you. Crosby Kemper, the president of or the chairman of the board of the Show Me Institute and who runs the library, wrote a letter to Troy Schulte saying, hey, can you please tell us, in accordance with some new national standards, how much money the city is diverting to developers? And Troy Schulte forwarded that request on to Mr. Landis, the head of the department, and said in that note, be very careful, do not divulge anything more than necessary. They will use it against us in the campaign. So what we have is our public servants are actually engaged in politics against us. They simply don't want to tell us what's going on. And so when the mayor stands up and says, you've got to have an alternative, what's your alternative? That's frustrating to hear because they won't share with us the basic information we need to suggest that alternative. That is all I have. I'm happy to take any questions, to clarify anything I've said, or God forbid, make any corrections. But yes, please. So my understanding, and I'm working with shadows here because sometimes the city approves a TIF, but it's not yet on the books. Before Cerner and Burns and Mack came on the books, I wrote to the finance department and I said, how much money are we diverting every year? And it's upwards of $110 million. And that's before Cerner and Burns and Mack. Now, the city, or the paper, wrote an editorial. They said, whoa, that number's way too high. It's only $77 million, which is still high. But the city wasn't including a number of diversions. I think the paper only published what the city gave them, frankly. So they say the earnings tax collects about 238 million, at least 110 million we divert right off the top to developers. The problem in that case is a lot of times those TIFs are 20, 23 years long. And so it's not something we can just stop doing, but we can certainly slow it down and realize that if we let this stuff expire and start to collect taxes on these properties, we'll be doing better. So one of the things I didn't include here, and I wish I had, the mayor put out a blog post on his site called Truth. You always love a blog post called Truth, right? Because you know there's going to be something in there that's good. But he said, we have spent $250 billion, is that right? That seems, $2.5 billion. $2.5 billion on the east side. Like, hey, east side, we haven't forgotten you, because I think the city's hearing a lot of frustrated people on the east side who don't think they're getting services. So he said, look, here's a document. So we looked at the document. Well, the number one expenditure for the east side, according to the mayor, was $375 million we spent to renovate Arrowhead Stadium. We had a discussion internally, despite the boundaries, if really Arrowhead Stadium could be considered the east side. Certainly, that expenditure is not something that, that supports neighborhoods. But the Citadel was also included, $52 million on that. And the Citadel was a project that never came to be. We paid some developers who then took us to court, I think, either before or after they went to jail, I'm not sure. They basically salted the land. It's got asbestos there, so we've turned undeveloped land into a Superfund site. But that $52 million in the bond, we're making bond payments on that stuff. We're making bond payments on power and light. This is all the debt that the city. So I don't know that it's that much. It may very well be, but absolutely, there's a great deal of it.